Welcome, everyone. My name is Anne Dolin, and I am your host this afternoon. We're talking about learning styles, the truth about learning styles, and why this all matters for your child's school success. When I started teaching in Fairfax County Public Schools, I was really into learning styles. They were all the rage. And in fact, they had trainings for teachers on how to understand kids' learning styles, how to give them this little quiz, see what kind of learner they were, and then to modify your classroom instruction based on the different types of learners in your classroom. Well, that was a long time ago. But even now, people think that learning styles really should drive instruction. But the information we have has really changed things up. In fact, many studies have come out more recently looking at the way kids are instructed in the classroom based on their learning style, and found that it had absolutely no bearing on how they retained information. So the bottom line is that learning styles and teaching to one modality actually doesn't really make a difference. There is no evidence in research that learning by just your one learning style makes a difference on what you retain, how you remember, and the scores you get on tests. So that does not mean that you don't have learning preferences, because oftentimes kids tell us, and Anne-Stuart, I'm going to pick your brain on this in just a second when I introduce you, that they definitely have a learning style, and parents say that too. And so when they're thinking of a learning style, what we're often hearing is that kids really have a preferred modality. Either it's visual. So visual means you like to see things. That means you like to look at things in front of you. You might like diagrams and pictures as you read. Maybe your preference is auditory. That means you like to study in a group. You like to learn from other people talking about something. You like lectures. Or it could be that your preferred way of learning is kinesthetic, meaning that you like the hands-on approach. Maybe you like to put things together. You could like science experiments, or you just like using pencil and paper and you like taking notes. So although we know that learning styles aren't a thing based on research, it doesn't mean that people don't have preferences in how they learn. Now, it doesn't mean that all their preferences are actually correct, and I'll get to that in a little bit, but it does mean that they have preferred modalities. So I'd love to pop up a poll, and I'm wondering what you think your child's learning style or learning preference is. How do they like to learn best? Jump into the poll if you don't mind. I'd love to hear what you think about your child. Oh, and wow. Interesting. Far and away, this kinesthetic or this tactile type of learning preference definitely has a stronghold on everything else. So about 61% of people said their kids like to learn kinesthetically. About 31 said visually, and that's all the way at the back is auditory, only at 10%. And, that's kind of what we hear in working with kids as well. So it's not surprising, but it is interesting to see that kids like to learn by doing. Now, why does all this matter? Well, it matters, and it matters a lot, because students, as I mentioned, they can have a preference. And if they are accurate in their preference, we have to teach them to learn into it, to lean into it. Meaning that they may study primarily in that way, but it cannot be the only way. And that is key. They need to layer the other modalities on top of it to really learn the information. So I'd love to bring in somebody who talks about this stuff all day long, and that is Anne-Stuart Kirkhorn. Welcome, Anne-Stuart. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, Anne. It's so great to be here today. Thank you.
Awesome. So Anne-Stuart is an education specialist with me here at Educational Connections. And her role is to talk to parents every day about their kids to better understand their needs. And once she does that, and we call that an intake, she gets history on the student, what they're needing help with. She then matches that student with a tutor based on lots of factors. but also personality, because that's a huge thing when you're making matches. And then once the match is made, she oversees that student's program for their journey with us. And, it's interesting because Anne-Stuart talks to parents all day long in different areas across the country. So she really does understand classroom trends. So Anne-Stuart, I'd love to ask you, what are some common things you hear from parents about how their children learn?
So I do talk to quite a few parents who will come in and tell me that their student does have a preference for visual learning, or they want to hear things. They like audiobooks. They want to hear things, and that's how they learn. But really, so many of the parents that I talk to feel like their students don't know what their study habits are. They don't have strong study habits, and maybe they've lost things like note taking, like we did when we were growing up, or how to review for a test properly, and how to absorb lots of information, say a history class or a science class where there's a lot of information they have to remember. And I'm also seeing that there's still gaps with COVID. A lot of students maybe missed that during a transition from middle school to high school or elementary to middle school, when they might have learned some of those study strategies, but that got lost when we were just in the middle of the crisis. So that's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I hear that too, that sometimes parents say, you know what, I don't even know if my child knows how to study in the first place. So you mentioned COVID. How have you seen that study habits have declined because of COVID?
So I think that the students just maybe didn't learn, that it wasn't impressed upon them what they needed to know during COVID, just because they were concentrating so much on the content and just how we could communicate that information that students had to have. So there are just gaps in terms of where should they study, or how did they need to study? How, like you said, taking notes was a big one, because so many parents will say, my student won't take notes. They don't understand the value of notes. And if they do take a note, what do they do with it? So I'm seeing that a lot.
Yeah, it seems like you mentioned that those transition years, if they missed out on essential habits during those transition years, it seems like even though we've been out of COVID for a couple of years, it's like still there. It's still relevant to their study habits. Well, let's kind of turn this around a little bit, Anne-Stuart. And I thought I would just touch base on what we know from the research about how kids learn best. So put aside learning styles, learning preferences, all that stuff. And let me just share with you some interesting things about when it comes to studying. So here's the thing, kids often will have a bunch of things to do when they come home from school. It could be assignments, it could be studying for a test. But it turns out that the time at which you do things is really important. I'll start out by sharing like an analogy that we can all relate to, and that is food. If you eat broccoli, if you don't like broccoli and you eat it first, you might not like it that much. On a scale of 1 to 10, you might rate it a 4. And then you eat pizza, and that's fabulous. But if you eat pizza first and then eat broccoli, studies show that you rate that food lower than if you ate it first. The same thing happens when we have low dopamine and high dopamine activities. So a low dopamine activity might be something that you do not like to do. Maybe it's writing an essay, but a high dopamine activity might be you love French and it's your favorite subject. You get a little kick out of that. If you do French first, it's going to make the harder thing seem even harder. So when we work with kids and they have to triage what they're going to do first, second, or third, we're always encouraging them to start with that hard thing first, because it doesn't feel as hard to get started than doing the reverse. And that comes from a recent study. There's even newer research on this at a University of Pennsylvania. And even another interesting component of studying relates to kids with ADHD. I just got back from the CHAD conference in Baltimore. That's children and adults with ADHD. And I went to a session on time preferences. And there's this new research coming out showing that kids with ADHD have a higher degree of time preference. That means that they're more alert, more motivated, and more focused at certain times of the day, more so than other kids. For example, if your child with ADHD comes home from school and you say, you know what, just get this done, bump it out so you can do other things during the day, and they're super, super resistant with you, I would not do that anymore. Research is showing that it's a losing battle. Their brain is not ready for learning, but if they're more alert, like around dinner time, that's probably when they should be starting. So if you have a child with ADHD or even inattentive issues, listen to their preference about time. And then we've known this for a long time when it comes to music. That's an issue. That's something too that we want to look at. And I just realized I duplicated the slides. Sorry about that, everybody. Music is a huge factor in our kids' lives. And, when we see kids, they always have earbuds in, they're always listening to music. And it turns out there's pros when it comes to music and studying. For example, it can make you more motivated to get going. It can reduce your stress, but it also has a lot of cons. First of all, it can be distracting. It impacts working memory, and working memory is when you're juggling lots of things in your head, specifically in math, where you're having to remember steps, or writing, where you have to remember lots of things, punctuation, grammar, sentence structure, all that stuff. Music impacts working memory negatively, and it also negatively impacts reading comprehension. So when it comes to studying, and kids are listening to music, it's not helping them retain the information. But if you have a child who's really pushing back on you, and they're insistent upon music, the best music is music without lyrics and also turned down to a lower volume. So those are some ins and outs of studying. Now, turns out there's also some best practices in terms of the way in which kids study. And there's lots of ways kids can study, but the number one way for retention is a concept called self-testing. Self-testing means that instead of reading your notes, you cover up a section and ask yourself that question. For example, let's say that you have your teacher's study guide. And what kids often do is they'll fill out a study guide. But a better way is to fill it out, which you usually do in class, make two clean copies, blank copies, and then the next day, fill it in the best you can without looking at the original until you can't remember anymore, and then do it again the next day. This is a concept of kind of quizzing yourself. So you're like asking yourself the question and you're filling in the answer. We teach kids all the time to create their own study guides if the teacher doesn't give them one. And this is especially powerful in math. And then the other way you can do self-testing is through software like Quizlet, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this concept is self-testing, where it's active, you're asking yourself questions, you're covering up the answers. But so is a concept called distributed practice. And sometimes people will call this spaced practice. But it's basically this concept of, instead of studying the night before for a test, you take that same amount of time and you distribute it into little chunks throughout the week. Maybe Tuesday for 15 minutes, Wednesday for 15 minutes, Thursday for 15 minutes, instead of just 45 the day before. Lots of research. This is a quote from Dartmouth. Spaced or distributive practice is superior to mass practice on long-term retention. And that's a key clue. Cramming might get you an okay grade the next day, but you're likely not going to remember it down the line. And so this concept of distributed practice, where you're learning something, you're sleeping on it, you're learning it again, you're sleeping on it, really, really helps to put that information into long-term memory. So let's get back to learning preferences. Many students will say, here, kids said, I like to learn by doing things. I like to learn by seeing things. And when we work with students, we're always in discussion with them. Tell me, how have you studied in the past? How has that worked for you? And we want to ascertain whether that is correct in the first place. But let's say that it is. Let's say that their preference is accurate. It doesn't just stop there with studying that way. In order to really learn it, you have to also layer the other modalities onto it. So, for example, let's say that the student is an auditory learner. So they're fine listening to lectures or listening to audiobooks. They like that. But they should also be taking notes, because we know that taking notes is both visual and it's kinesthetic. And that those added layers will really help them to retain that information from a lecture. Anne-Stuart, you mentioned taking notes. And you said that a lot of kids don't know how to take notes, or they're not taught properly. And that is true. This note-taking method, which we use with students, is called Cornell Notes. It's really powerful. It's probably the most popular note-taking strategy across the country. But the way that you do it is different than just writing down anything. You take your paper, you can do this on a laptop too, and you make a line so that the left third of your paper is for key concepts or ideas, and on the right are notes. So you can see here in this example, let's say you're studying Guatemala. The key idea is, what are the 4 neighboring countries? And then you list those countries. Now, to study, you cover up the answer, the 4 neighboring countries, and you say, what are those countries? And you test yourself. Again, it's that concept of self-testing. And that's why Cornell Notes works super well. The other part I like about Cornell Notes is that at the very bottom, when you're done taking notes for that day, you draw a big line, and then in a sentence or maybe 2, you summarize the main concepts of what you've learned. And that concept of summarizing is just so powerful for kids to know the information. So let's say, again, you have an auditory learner. They like group study sessions. Fabulous. They can also make flashcards. And Stuart, you and I made flashcards, didn't we?
You did.
We did. And, we think they're old fashioned, but lots of research has shown that flashcards are great. And so encouraging kids, we'll always encourage kids to take that extra step. All right. So let's say you have a visual learner, and many of you did, and they like to reread their notes. And in fact, I don't know if I mentioned this, but there are studies that show that the majority of kids study by reading their notes. And that's how, they'll read their notes, then they say I've studied. In fact, it's like 84% of kids report that they study like that. That is fine, but not if it's the only thing. If you're going to reread your notes, you need to stop at each section and ask yourself, what's important here, and be able to jot down a couple phrases or a quick sentence on summarizing that. It's kind of like that bottom line in Cornell Notes. That's key is to stop every now and then and ask, what's important here? Or what does my teacher want me to know here? Often kids, especially I would say a lot of girls, love highlighters, and they'll be all over highlighting when they read. There is no evidence that highlighting helps you remember, especially when you're doing it when you're reading, because you don't know what's important. And before you know it, you've gone highlighter happy and you've highlighted the whole page, and that's not helpful. But that jotting down, that annotation is helpful. Let's say you have a child who's also a visual learner. Maybe they're reviewing the teacher's slide deck. They should also be taking digital notes on the side of the slides. And again, asking themselves, what's important here? Same concept. Maybe you have a kinesthetic learner. They like to learn by doing. They might also be able to take notes, even if they don't write everything out, by writing a phrase, drawing a picture. That's fine too. But if they're going to take notes, they really are going to benefit from printing out those notes, cutting them up, and then putting them in one pile and asking themselves that topic. They look at it, they say, what are the 4 neighboring countries to Guatemala? If they know it, it goes in I know it pile. If they don't know it, it goes into the I don't know it pile. And they do this with each section of their notes until they've divided it into 2 piles. And then they just need to focus on the I don't know it pile. And they're practicing that. So anytime we can put things on flashcards, on note cards, we can put it on Post-it notes, we can cut it up. That helps those kinesthetic learners. And then I mentioned Quizlet. Quizlet is fabulous. It really helps kids to learn vocabulary words. It helps them with foreign languages. Ideally, kids are creating their own deck of cards, but often that's not what happens. If they're in AP Bio and they have a quiz in the first quarter on 15 words, chances are some other kid has already created a flashcard deck with those 15 words. So kids will often just use somebody else's. If you're going to do that, if they're going to do that, we always encourage them. There's another feature on Quizlet where they can take auditory notes, audio notes, and attach it to the card. They can play lots of games on Quizlet. So those games are really great for kinesthetic learners. All right. So some common concerns, and Anne-Stuart, I know you hear these quite frequently.
I do.
Motivation. Tell me about it.
So a lot of parents that I talk to will tell me that their child is just not motivated to study. They may have done well in a previous years, and now this year their grades are slipping and they just don't seem to care, and they aren't doing what a parent feels that the child's capable of doing. And as parents, we know what our children are capable of doing. We've seen them, we know them. And it's frustrating for parents when they see a child who know they can do it, but they're not showing any gumption to do it. So what we've found, and in talking with our coaches and with parents, once a student work with a coach, is a lot of times it's not that they don't care. They actually really do care, but they don't know how to study. They don't have the skills in place. And I love what you shared about the layering, because a lot of times if they can find what works for them, it does help motivate them, because they just don't have the skills that they need. And it's sort of a it's a defense mechanism for them. They'll say, well, if I don't try, then I didn't fail. And so then they don't try, and then it's not as tough for them when they don't do as well. But as a parent, that's really frustrating because we know they can do it, right?
It's true. We do. And my kids have had executive function coaches over the years. And I know, Anne-Stuart, your kids have benefited too from that. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that concept of quick wins and how that helps with motivation.
Yeah, so we try to look for, when students are working with coaches, we try to find those quick wins that they can have. So we know that teaching executive functioning skills is not something that happens overnight. But when we want students to see value in what they're doing, and if we can find something that maybe they've struggled with in the past, like they have a quiz and they always say, well, I always do poorly on my science quizzes, I don't know why. If we can help give them some strategies and help them to study, and they do get a better grade, it starts to build their confidence. And so that does help with the motivation there too. So we do look for those quick wins.
Yeah, those quick wins. So let's continue on the topic of motivation. To me, it's so fascinating. Why are some kids more motivated than others? And it turns out there's lots of theories around motivation, but I wanted to share with you one that I find the most helpful to understand student academic motivation, and it's called the self-determination theory. And there are three parts of this theory. The first one is competence, that the student has to feel like they can do the work, like it's not too hard and they can do it well. So they have to feel like they have the skills to do it. Sometimes, we think because they did it once, they can do it again. But, many of our kids are consistently inconsistent. And when they're not feeling 100% competent, they will not do the work because they don't feel that they can do it well. Now, there's also autonomy. And that means, do you feel like you can do the work without a lot of micromanagement? I was actually talking to a friend of mine yesterday, her son. She was saying he's a senior and he's extremely personality specific. So if he doesn't like the teacher and the teacher's like, you have to do it this way, you have to show all your work in math, and I want it done like this, he won't do it because even though he's competent, he won't do it because that's her idea and he doesn't feel like he has the autonomy. And so for some kids, this idea of autonomy is one of their issues when it comes to motivation. And then the other, and I personally see this one a lot, kids need to have a purpose. They have to feel like there's some relatedness, but they don't always know what that purpose is. They have to feel like the task is meaningful to them. So, for example, let's say that the student needs to learn how to solve for a missing angle in geometry. And they'll say, this is so dumb. I'm never going to have to solve for a missing angle in real life. Well, chances are they may not. That could be true. But the reality is that if they can learn to solve for this missing angle and they can learn it well enough to do well on this quiz, do well on a test, have a decent grade in geometry, and that falls into their overall GPA. And then they're able to go off to Savannah College of Arts and Design because they want to study media. And that's their thing. And it's not math. Sometimes kids with enough purpose will say, I don't think I need to know this, but I'm willing to do it because I can see what's coming down the line. But sometimes kids don't have that forward thinking that they're able to do. And that's all about purpose. So really, in order to have internal motivation, like you do it because you want, really all of these factors have to be there. And so we see kids all the time where they're missing one, they're missing two. It could be an issue with all of these. And that's why often kids are resistant to help. And Stuart, I know you hear this from parents too, that, I don't know if my child will do this. They seem really not into it.
I do. And I saw someone in the chat put that in as well, that she'd like for her daughter to do it, but she can't sell it to the daughter. So we do see some students that come in resistant. People come in at different levels. And so our coaches try to meet students where they are and help them from that point. We want to show students value, and that goes back to the quick wins when we work at them. But in order to sell it to your child, sometimes it helps if you let your child know that this is not a tutor, and it's not because they some students perceive tutoring as they're not intelligent enough to be able to do it on their own and they want to do it on their own. But just letting them know this is a coach, someone that we have hopefully matched with them, that they'll enjoy working with, that they can work collaboratively with. And so they're working as a team with somebody. And sometimes that helps students when they're resistant to starting working with a coach or to getting help from either from mom and dad. It's a team thing. Can be your idea as well.
Yeah, for sure. And, kind of to that point where we want to meet kids where they are. I'm going to talk in a second about this model called the trans-theoretical model. And this is derived from that. It's another motivation theory. But when people are struggling with something, when kids are struggling with something, oftentimes, or they're not doing well in school, or they could be doing okay in school, but we all know they could be doing better. And the parent calls us and says, my child is so disorganized. He can't find any of his materials. He doesn't know when things are due. I really want you to work on organization, plus all these other things. And then Anne-Stuart, for example, might assign a coach with that child. The coach will start working with the student and realize this child is not interested in learning organization, but they are interested in getting a better grade. You mentioned that science answer, getting a better grade in science, and they're interested in improving their study skills. That's where we're going to start with the students. So we have an assessment that looks at all the executive function skills, and within it, kids rate themselves. I see this as a problem. I see this as a problem and I really want help. I kind of see it as a problem, but I'm not sure, or I refuse to do anything with this. And it's based on that trans-theoretical model I just mentioned called the stages of change. So kids come to us, they might be at the very bottom rung. Like, I'm not going to change on one skill, but on another skill, they're willing to accept help. And so that's always where we want to start. We will backdoor it into organization later on. But initially, for parents, for coaches, for anybody, when you're working with your child on something hard, your goal is to earn trust. That's it. You just want to have a good relationship and for that child to know that you're trustworthy and you're on their side. Now, that being said, we also want to help hold kids accountable. Anne-Stuart, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I think with our coaches, that's one of their main jobs, because we know that kids, even kids who want to do well, they just sometimes cannot. That's part of executive functioning coach, their skills, right? It's that you're not really staying on top of things. You're not as accountable as you should be. So when our coaches work with students, the first thing they always do is they'll pull up the student's learning management system or have the student bring it up and share it with them, so they can go through that, make sure that nothing's falling through the cracks. They know what's coming up, and they kind of can break things down and set up, we call them micro goals for the week, so that they know what they need to do each day. We don't want students to get so overwhelmed with the work that they can't see past the big picture of the work. We never want them to say, oh, I have a paper due. The paper comes in multiple different sections to get to the big finished paper. So what does that look like for a child? And then just setting those small deadlines. So we check in with students. If they may be meeting twice a week with a coach, or they may be meeting once a week and having to check in with them, just to make sure that they are staying on top of things. And then the other thing we do promote is self-advocacy. So if we see that a child doesn't have something turned in, or it looks like that hadn't been turned in, or the teacher maybe hadn't graded it, and maybe we've seen that for a time or two, and the student says, oh, well, Mrs. Jones just hasn't graded that yet. Rather than take their word for it always, we kind of help hold them accountable by having them maybe email their teacher and say, I think I turned this in, and can you check to see if you received it? Because sometimes we find that maybe they haven't turned it in, or maybe they've completed it and it just hasn't gotten submitted, because that happens too. Students forget to submit, even though they're done with the assignment. So that helps. And once they get in the habit of that and reaching out to teachers, then that helps them hold themselves accountable.
Yeah, that's a great point, Anne-Stuart. That self-advocacy piece is key. And we're happy to help if you think this would be beneficial, what Anne-Stuart shared with your child. You can absolutely reach out to her. You can schedule a time to talk with her just by scanning this QR code that goes straight to her calendar. And you'll set up a time to talk with her directly. And she can share a little bit about our program. You share about your child and see if what we offered can be a match. And if not, hopefully she can point you in the right direction as well. All right, so I'd love to go to Q&A, because we have a lot of questions in the chat and also some in the Q&A section. And after the Q&A, there is going to be a survey that pops up. And if you would be so kind to fill out that survey, that would be fabulous. Thank you so much. All right, so let me go to the chat and see what we have up first. And these are some of the things that parents said. Carolina said, my daughter will be tested for ADHD. And that's fabulous. The more information we can get, sometimes having that diagnosis, whether you have it or not, is such a relief to kids, because then they know what they're dealing with. And there are so many strategies to help kids with ADHD. So I'm so glad that you're doing that, Carolina. Let's see. Jennifer says, my daughter is not internally motivated and doesn't seem to have organization skills. We see this all the time, that often kids struggle with organization. And one thing that I can recommend that has helped kids over the years to just kind of keep up with organization, is not going to totally fix their problem. But I found this to be helpful in my family. I have ADHD and both my kids do too. And so anything I could do to help myself, I noticed also helped them. And so on Sundays, I would set aside time. We call this the clean sweep, where I would set the timer and they would use that time to clean out their backpack, clean up their little study area. Sometimes they would organize their messy desktops, all their files. But it just kind of gave them a chance, and me a chance too. I would do things to get ready for work. I would clean up the kitchen, whatever, just to dedicate it to setting up a system of getting things organized for the week. So for kids that lack that, they have to have a routine around organization. You can turn up the music, make it really fun for your kids, but having some type of regular thing can definitely help with organization. Let's see. My daughter struggles by reading her textbooks. So Jennifer, what I would recommend for reading textbooks is definitely anytime kids are reading, they have to have either their laptop out where they're taking notes, or better yet, because studies show that actually when you have pen and paper, rather than typing, you're going to retain more information. They should have a notebook and pen and paper ready to take notes as they read. So that's the best way to retain information while you're reading. It doesn't have to be arduous. It can be a picture. It can be just a few phrases, but that will help you capture that information. Let's see. My son easily memorized and can recite back what he hears, but I understand this does not reflect his learning style, but an ability. How do I support this ability? So if your child is really good at memorizing things, maybe facts, you might ask him, why do you think this is important to know? Or why do you think your teacher wants you to know this? Any of these why questions are better for a kid that learns just like facts, because it helps them to understand the meaning behind it. The same thing when you're reading a textbook or reading a novel with your child, if they let you, and let's say they're a reluctant reader, so you read a page and they read a page, or you read 2 pages and they read 2 pages. You might say, oh, I wonder how so-and-so is feeling about this, or I wonder what could happen next. Like those I wonder questions are really, really good for kids that like more factual things, because they help kids to kind of see through the lines and really work on their reasoning skills. Let's see. With more testing that shows a weakness in, so if you have testing that shows, if the child likes visual and the testing shows that they're not strong in visual, how else what are some other ways to learn? So if kids say, I really like visual, and they're not good in that way, it could be that they may not learn through reading visually, but they still like pictures. So when they're working on a textbook, and depending on the grade, I'm not sure, but sometimes, well, when working with kids like that, I'd have them look at the pictures first. And I'd say before they started, what do you think this is going to be about based on these pictures? So it's a visual modality, but now you're also in discussion mode, and that can help too. Let's see. My daughter has ADHD and she likes listening to music during homework. I thought that it helped with her focus. And Philomena, it could, I saw one study that showed there's an incredibly small subset of kids with ADHD that actually benefit from all types of music. So she could be in that subset. I'm not sure. But in general, kids they have the illusion of studying. I know my younger son, he's a senior in college. We've had this discussion so many times, and sometimes he will turn off the music, and I know sometimes he doesn't. But he will listen to music when he's studying, or a podcast, which is even worse because you're listening to somebody else's words. But it's interesting when he's studying for something that's really meaningful and he's under the gun to get a good grade, he will turn off the music. So sometimes kids can gauge how meaningful it is that they're doing. Like, is this required reading, or do I absolutely have to know this to retain it for a test? And so often when we work with kids and they're super insistent on music, first we say, be a detective. What if you tried this without music once and asked yourself, what did I read about? And see if you can retain more information. We'll also share with them, some of the information on music, and encourage them also to be strategic, because sometimes you may not be able to change what they do, but sometimes they're willing to do that if the grade is very important for them. Somebody asked, will we be recording this? And the answer is yes. Allison said, self-testing is wonderful, acting as the teacher, so to speak. And yes, you can also say, if you're working with your child, if they let you, not all kids won't, but definitely a younger child, tell me how to solve this problem. Oh, how did your teacher show you how to do this? Did she have a strategy around this? I'm interested in that. So kind of putting them in the teacher's seat and having them explain it to you is really helpful. So thank you for that. Let's see. If distributed practice works better, I wonder why school boards set up schedules into semestered learning. It seems backwards. Well, it used to be that we had a lot more tests. I know when I was a teacher in some subjects, I'd have a mini quiz every Friday. And kids hated that. They just thought it was the worst idea, but I liked it because I could judge what they were understanding and I could intervene quickly instead of waiting for like, oh, you're going to have a quiz on the test on this in 3 weeks. And then you realize, wow, this child really doesn't understand it. But there's actually lots of research on frequent quizzing, and it's incredibly powerful for learning. And so ideally, kids would be having more really mini quizzes. So not to take out of instructional time, but also these quick quizzes allow kids, not just the teacher, but the child to see, okay, I really don't know this. I need to change my ways, or I really need to study this. Or, you know what, I'm good. I do know this. So in a perfect world, we would have more of that, but it is more work for the teacher. And it depending on how you do it, it can potentially cut into instructional time. And at a time when we're all about standardized tests, that could impact it. Let's see. Cherie said, my son does a weekly session on OutSchool. I like OutSchool. There's lots of good programs there. That's great. Anatomy and relatedness autonomy and relatedness are both challenges for my son. Can you clarify the difference between executive function and tutoring versus counseling and therapy? My child has ADHD, deficits in executive function and anxiety. He's open to therapy. Great. I would definitely go for that. You might just try that first and see how he does. Often once kids feel like they can talk to somebody and they're more open, the therapist can talk to them about being open for other kinds of help too. So it could be over time they'll open up to other kinds of assistance. But sometimes we get kids that are they're pretty resistant, but they're not 100% resistant. And you kind of know your child. If they're like absolutely not 100%, I'm not doing this, it's probably not a good time. But if they say, I really don't want to do this, but okay, we can get through to them, and we help those kids all day long. So you kind of have to judge where your child is in that. And then what is tutoring? Tutoring is specific to a subject. So a tutor would be like a math tutor, a writing tutor, a science tutor, for example. Sometimes you can do a little bit of subject tutoring and some executive function, but to do a really good job with executive function, we teach these skills. But then, I don't know if we mentioned this, part of what we do is we ask kids, we'll say, Anne-Stuart, you could probably talk about this a little bit too. What's heavy on your mind? Let's start with what's hard. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I think like you were saying earlier with the broccoli and the lasagna, if you start with something that is harder and the coach can work with you so you know where to go with that. A lot of times once students get started on something, they don't have to finish it right there, but they know what to do next. Sometimes getting started is the hardest part of it. And so I think that starting with the hard stuff that you don't want to do and then saving the lasagna for later is maybe easier. And if it's a subject you like and you do it on your own, then you can get to it. If it's hard, the chances that you'll get started with a lot of parents I talk to, their students just don't start. They just don't turn it in. So
yeah, I hear you. And somebody else said that her daughter can learn things in theory and then doesn't apply them. You don't want to, whenever you're getting help for executive function skills, you really don't want kids just to learn theory. We used to do that, to be honest. And I used to teach these classes to kids it was really on theory, like, oh, here's how you prioritize assignments. These are reading comprehension strategies. Here's how you memorize stuff. And it worked in the moment, but there wasn't carryover. And so I wouldn't recommend going down that path where kids are learning theory, because if they don't see how to apply it to what they're doing, it's not going to be beneficial long term. And so, when we teach a skill, we always teach it in the child's work. So they see, oh, I do this in my English class like this, or like Anne-Stuart said, we start with a hard thing. We'll teach them, okay, when it's hard and I don't want to do it, these are the strategies I use to get over that hump and get started. And so anything kids do, they will not see buy-in if it's in theory. They have to have it related to what they're doing. Let's see, what else? Sherry said, my son seems exhausted after school from making it all day. So it's hard for him to do homework or study. Sherry, I'm not sure of the grade level of your child, but I would definitely start by keeping a log of how long it's taking to do work. Because if your child's doing an inordinate amount of homework, if he's in third grade and he's doing more than, I don't know, definitely more than a half hour, I would stop there and I would let the teacher know, it took him 45 minutes to do these two things, so that you're able to have a discussion with her about perhaps reducing the amount of work that's being sent home so it's tenable. Like, the last thing we want is for kids to hate homework, because if they don't like school and now they hate homework, 75% of the really difficult, and we do not want that for kids. We want it hard for some of our kids, and we want to make that after school time as easy as possible for students. So all right, so I think those are all the questions. Anne-Stuart, thank you so much for being on with me today. It was so nice to talk to you and hear the input and hear what you're hearing from parents too. Thanks everybody for being with us. If you wouldn't mind taking the survey at the end, we would so appreciate it. It was a pleasure. I hope you have a great day and a wonderful holiday. Take care and bye-bye.